Thank you, first of all, for joining us. Thank you to everyone who is here and for you guys to submitting this panel that I actually am really looking forward to hearing about. So the order is going to be Sandra Gabriel first. Oh, I gotta admit I'm multitasking. So Sandra Gabriel will go first. Sandra is the Vice Provost Innovation in Teaching and Learning and also Associate Professor in Communication Studies. Also, this was co-written with Robert Cassidy. So Robert unfortunately can't be here with us today. He is the Director of the Center for Teaching and Learning also at Concordia University. Then Darren Werschler will go next, Associate Professor English Department at Concordia University. And we'll end with Bart Simon, Associate Professor of Sociology and Anthropology, and also the Institute Director for Milieu Institute for Arts, Culture, and Technology, also at Concordia University. So the floor is yours, Sandra.
The paper that I'm presenting today is kind of the framework. So I'm gonna kick things off. Then I'll introduce Darren and Bart and have them present the findings from one of our first projects coming out of Little, which is the Lab for Innovation in Teaching and Learning. And just to mention that the paper I'm presenting was originally meant to also be delivered by my very close colleague, Rob Cassidy, who's unfortunately unable to join us today, who's the director of the Center for Teaching and Learning. Okay, so let me start. So in 2018, Concordia launched a rather ambitious initiative as part of its Next Generation Learning and University campaign. It was a digital strategy that touched on all aspects of the university's business. Out of that campaign, the Lab for Innovation in Teaching and Learning, affectionately called Little, was born. Formed with the ambition of sparking innovation in teaching technologies, practices, approaches, theories of learning, and enhancing learning practices, the lab was officially launched in late 2019. Today, I'll introduce you to the ideas behind Little, allow my colleagues, Dr. Darren Werschler and Dr. Bart Simon, an opportunity to tell you a little bit about their Minecraft project and some interesting early findings, and then conclude the session with a few brief reflections on what we've learned in our first year of being quote unquote open while actually being closed throughout the pandemic. As Concordia's home for teaching and learning innovation, Little's mandate is to undertake pedagogical experimentation and prototype next generation learning experiences. To fulfill this mandate, Little first launched with an idea of focusing on the R&D process laid out in this slide. As you can see in this slide, we imagined our work is concentrating on the very early stages of innovation primarily. And the challenge with this early conceptualization is that the outcomes are really outside of the mandate somehow, as is funding, something that the vice provost in me probably should have caught earlier, right? And so what you'll also notice in this particular articulation of the innovation cycle is that we're also seeing it in this early stage. So I should mention that this was in one of our earliest kind of foundational documents that was part of our mandate and founding documents, if you will. And so this was our very earliest conceptualization, which we saw as being really rather linear. How we've actually worked has not proven really to resemble this at all. And I'm actually pretty relieved to say that we have already moved on from that from September of 2019. So Little approaches its work with a dual focus on the methods, tools, and technologies that directly facilitate student learning, as well as the formats, structures, policies, and processes that indirectly support student learning. This dual focus signals a commitment to innovation within context. And that's really, I guess, if I could say there's a theme for this talk today, it's that there, the innovation in context. To facilitate innovation activities, Little provides key pieces of institutional infrastructure: space, equipment, project management, research assistant support, technical support, and potentially release time for faculty. In addition, Little also brokers collaborations between Concordia faculty members from other post-secondary institutions, educational researchers, and other teaching and learning innovators like entrepreneurs or educational technology companies. as well as industry professionals who may have relevant expertise on certain kinds of projects. Since its first foundation within the digital strategy, we've now moved Little into its permanent home, which is within the Center for Teaching and Learning. And it's meant to position Concordia at the leading edge of pedagogical experimentation. And it's meant to create a space for focused, institutionally supported pedagogical R&D. At the time of our opening, we launched with 3 core projects. One was a cross-institutional collaboration with Dawson College, a cégep here in Montreal, Concordia University Center for Continuing Education, and a startup called Corbett, who had been developing a product to support directed student learning in coding and machine learning. And then the last 2 projects that were our first projects to launch were ones that were that are deeply implicated in faculty research interests. So the first one is the Minecraft project that you'll hear about today, and then the second one is a project on social and emotional skills that's actually gone through 3 iterations already in just the span of the last year. The projects have all to date used technology to accomplish exploring specific learning challenges or goals. And this has been important since particularly we began the life of Little as part of the digital strategy, though we've always been committed to moving beyond a sort of narrow focus, if you will, on technologies per se. Gearing up to our launch, we visited several innovation labs in the United States and the fantastic Emerging Media Lab at UBC, as well as commissioned a small consulting firm to interview more innovation leaders with a focus on teaching and learning at other universities, as well as outside of universities. So we also interviewed some capital venture firms that fund specifically teaching and learning initiatives, as well as a couple of other startups. This process was important not only for the sake of kind of building up a brand, if you will, knowing what it was that we were entering into, knowing the landscape, but also critically for allowing us to analyze and refine our positioning to our internal Concordia community and to external partners, and to understand the nature of these potential collaborative relationships across the internal-external dynamic so that we can advance teaching and learning innovation. As the conversation around the lab has evolved, our interest remains on pedagogical R&D, and this comes with specific challenges that I will talk about today. So I realize that I have to toggle in between my screens to make things move. The 4 challenges that I want to talk about today are cultivating innovation in a university, leveraging and building partnerships, the role of university admin, and then how to adequately define the scope of projects, what success looks like, and how to sustain those successes institutionally. In other words, for me, that question is, what are the conceptual edges of a lab? So perceptions of how innovation should function in a university setting are quite varied. And in fact, like many universities across the country, Concordia has been supporting innovation through a variety of initiatives that promote entrepreneurship. So an example of that at Concordia is our D3, which is the Center for Entrepreneurship. Acceleration for scientific ventures. We have another body called V1, which takes innovation from lab to market. So it works as an accelerator. Innovation and creative thinking, and this is a newly launched innovation lab which centers on building partnerships with industry to teach students specifically innovation skills, and more targeted innovation support in the realms of synthetic biology. And that one really derives very directly from a very strong group of researchers that we have in the area of synthetic biology. These initiatives have grown out of the interest in the university sector to contribute further in what is recognized as Canada's lagging innovation economy. The results at Concordia have been mixed, with take-up supported in some arenas, so the sciences, as I was just referencing, and engineering have made gains within the faculty ranks, and students in particular have very readily participated in innovation lab challenges. But the venture into teaching and learning is really a first for Concordia, and I'll say that not just because of the pandemic, but especially because of the pandemic, there's a whole new focus now at Concordia on teaching and learning, which I suspect is not uncommon in many university sectors. So Concordia's various efforts at supporting innovation in teaching and learning to date have been met with I'd say, mixed success. We've had a lot of one-off ventures to support projects that failed to make lasting impacts in many cases, particularly when project funding dried up. So this is one of the ongoing challenges, and what leads me to the last two challenges that I've noted on this slide that's in front of you right now in particular, and I'll return to that after Darren and Bart speak. But before I turn it over to them, I want to just briefly speak about the importance of building out partnerships. So the genesis of the project that you'll hear about today emerged from earlier experimentations and research conducted in TAG, which is Concordia's Research Center for Technoculture, Art, and Games. Building out the relationship with research centers and the research interests of faculty has led to the adoption of the two projects that I referenced earlier, this one and the social and emotional skills. They've been very important projects for us in establishing connections with faculty. And I'll just advance that. As our research has found from other university-based labs working specifically in teaching and learning, connecting with faculty research interests, that is finding this magical overlap between research and teaching, has been critical in establishing projects and partnerships. In the case of the Minecraft as Classroom project, tapping into a vast pool of talent has made the project successful without industry or external partnerships. Though our interest does lie in building out partnerships with industry, and indeed one of our very successful projects that's not being discussed today, not only partners with a startup and another higher educational institution, it was also funded by a Nova Science grant from the Ministère de l'Économie et de l'Innovation. Our earliest finding at this time then is that leveraging and building partnerships is really about establishing community by responding to the needs of that community. And in year one, this has meant building out a value proposition. And again, I'm just putting that in scare quotes because it's drawing on the language of innovation that in some cases is appropriate and others isn't. But it's really about building out a value proposition for faculty as one of our key stakeholders at the university. In this case, building a space to advance both research and teaching simultaneously has been an important first accomplishment. As you'll see in the presentations by Darren and then Bart, we have managed to leverage and really be able to now articulate pretty clearly our values as a lab. And I think, as you'll see with their discussion, that this first project of Minecraft as Classroom project is really important in really confirming that these are important values for a lab at a place like Concordia at this moment in time at Concordia. Equitable learning, openness, cross-pollination, spontaneity, network mindset, and empowerment speak to the need to build meaningful partnerships that spark on a personal level, that build bridges, and that create new opportunities for learning for students and cross-pollinate across the disciplines and ways of working and thinking. So I'm going to stop there for now. I will stop the share. And I will turn it over to Darren to tell you a little bit about the project itself.
Okay, thanks, Sandra. Okay, so imagine a situation where you know a fair bit about a particular academic area of study. For example, the history, culture, and technology of modernity. And say you also know a thing or two about Minecraft, which at this point is still easily the best-selling video game in history. And say you also have a friend who knows something about Minecraft, but nothing about the theory and history of modernity. What if there were enough connections between the two things that you started wondering if, under the right circumstances, you could use Minecraft to teach your friend about modernity? That's the possibility that we've been exploring with video games and as theory this winter. I've been using Minecraft as the subject matter in this course on and off since 2014, but under pandemic conditions, with the support of the Concordia Lab for Innovation in Teaching and Learning, I decided to try something a little more adventurous. Since January, I've been running a flipped class, which means that the students spend their classroom hours working in teams on our Minecraft server, using it as a kind of experiential laboratory. At some point in their week, they listen to the lectures, which take the form of audio podcasts, and they do the course readings, which are about various aspects of modernity rather than video games. I'm in more or less constant contact with the students through Minecraft, our courseware Moodle, and our chat rooms in Discord. At the same time, a research team of 14 from 5 fields in 3 different universities has been working with the students and studying their various activities. Bart will be discussing the research aspect of this project in his paper, so I won't go into a lot of detail about it here. I see this course as an intervention on several levels. Of course, I was curious about the utility of using a game as a teaching platform under pandemic conditions, and whether it might alleviate Zoom fatigue and create a greater degree of student engagement. I'm also interested in whether team-based student learning in such an environment can impart future skills like collaboration, planning, project design and management, interpersonal communication, and reporting. On the level of field and subject matter, I wanted to know whether it was possible to use Minecraft as an allegory for the relatively more complex ideas in the theory and history of modernity. In addition, I consider this project to be an intervention in several fields: into game studies, which tends to ignore the longer history of communication studies and cultural studies research in favor of its own arguments; into education research, which overwhelmingly positions Minecraft as a tool for working with children and people with ASD. Pretty much everything else we want to accomplish with this course depends on that first question. Can we use this approach to create a greater than usual degree of engagement? Because we have been tracking the login and logout times of every user on our server, we have extremely detailed information about how much time each student spends on class activities. The graphs that I'm about to show you were prepared by Stuart Thiel, an engineer and the leader of the development portion of our team. So our initial data shows that engagement levels are pretty high. Out of 35 students, 3 of them rarely played. 14 played mostly during the originally scheduled class hours from 10:15 to 11:30 twice a week, or about 2.5 hours of official class time. 8 played mostly outside of class times, and 10, these are the long haulers, this is Stuart's term, regularly played for more than 4 hours at a stretch. Average time on the server per student was about 3 hours per day, every day, with more on the days that the course calendar identified as class times. If you look at the bars, the green ones are Tuesdays and Thursdays, so you can get a pretty clear sense of how they're spending more time in the server on those days. Average time on total play hours for the course range from 392 hours over the term at the top end, with 5 students putting in over 200 hours, 3 more than 150 hours, 4 more than 120 hours, and 5 more than 50 hours, down to a low of about 3 hours total for the course. We also have full logs of all of the text from Discord, which are also time-stamped, but without going into too many details, conversations regularly go on into the small hours of the morning. So there's no doubt that we have their attention. The next big questions are, what can we do with that attention to make learning occur, and what could we teach? Because Minecraft players habitually refer to their in-game creations as builds, Bart and I call our pedagogical model for this course the allegorical build. It works like this. Allegory, a narrative device that uses assemblages of events, actions, and objects as an occasion to think through complex ideas, is a powerful interpretive tool. It has a long history of use in philosophical and critical thinking that extends from classical antiquity up to contemporary materialist investigations of digital media and culture. For Frederick Jameson, allegory is a way of dramatizing the rejection of what he calls a naive and representational immediacy in interpretation. Jameson often uses allegory to focus not on symbolic content, but on the material and linguistic nature of texts as objects. For Jameson, allegory is not static. It takes place in time. That is, it is literally the process of critical thinking itself, in which our initial assumptions about the literal meanings of something often prove to be too convenient, and we find that we have to replace them with something more reflective. One of Jameson's students, Alexander Galloway, specifically took up allegorical methodology as a way of thinking about video games. Galloway describes video games as control allegories, arguing that video games don't hide their systems of control. If anything, they flaunt them. Think for a moment about the grid that surrounds and positions everything in Minecraft, making it findable, legible, and useful. The grid is one of the master control techniques of modernity, but digital culture perfected it in the form of the database. We learn to play the game literally by aligning ourselves with the grid and synchronizing our behavior with the game's control system. The form of the control system of any piece of software is an algorithm, a specific set of instructions for solving a particular type of problem. Algorithms don't have to be performed by computers. You can do them, say, when you're doing long division or following a recipe. But computer programs are implementations of algorithms in particular coding languages. To do well at a game, you have to make some inferences about what its algorithms specify and then meet those specifications as best you can. As you learn to play a game like Minecraft, you're becoming what Bart calls close to the code, meaning that you are developing a sense of the results that various algorithms produced in the game itself. This doesn't mean you understand the code or would recognize it if it suddenly appeared in front of you on the screen. What it means is that you are effectively building allegories of the game's algorithms. Galloway and his contemporary and occasional collaborator, Mackenzie Wark, cram the two words together into a portmanteau and call this process an algorithm. While playing video games, we construct algorithms by conducting experiments. In the low-resolution, voxel-aided world of Minecraft, players feel as if they have more control over the conditions that produce the world as they experience it, that things are somehow testable. There's a long tradition of video game players conducting semi-empirical experiments in particular game worlds in order to answer questions about the physics of the game when they could be answered definitively by reading the code. In a recent article, one of our team members, Nick Watson, coins the term procedural elaboration as a description for such activities in Minecraft, where the production of descriptive procedural knowledge through experimentation is a form of gameplay in itself, rather than a means toward the development of instrumentally effective strategies. This typically is where a video game studies approach would stop. What I want to think about with this course goes one step further, considering the relationship of the algorithm to the critical readings and course lectures. This relationship is the allegorical build, the moment when the students use the algorithm to think about something else. In this case, a series of core readings concerning the theory and history of modernity. I think this is a more qualified and more defensible approach than positioning games as an allegory for real-world issues. The course syllabus was deliberately designed to scaffold the long process of the allegorical build. It presents students with the choice of one of 4 possible ways to fulfill course requirements, ranging from largely independent research and writing to various combinations of group project-based work and written assignments, with groups persisting over the course of the term. All students participated in an initial warm-up exercise, which both provided some instruction in basic Minecraft procedures and gave them a low-stakes sense of how they would be marked in the class. Each group then chose from the syllabus 1 or 2 project themes to develop and submitted a short proposal for approval. These project themes are associated with the topics of 1 or more readings from the syllabus. Completing a given assignment requires both a given team's in-game project and individual reflection papers from all team's members. The allegorical build is a long process, beginning with hesitations and the realization of misperceptions, then slowly but deliberately working toward a negotiation of in-game activity and critical readings toward a third thing. That third thing isn't simply a theoretically informed understanding of the game, which would be the goal in game studies, nor is it a better understanding of the critical material alone, which would be a media historical or cultural studies approach, but an ongoing intensive form of learning in which the theoretical and philosophical potential of the readings is doubled by the experimental and technical milieu of procedural elaboration in the game, transforming both components in the process. On the first day of class, many students were clearly expecting not Minecraft as classroom, but a classroom in Minecraft. One group immediately pulled together a carefully designed, well-lit amphitheater, presumably under the assumption that I'd be lecturing to their avatars in a group. When it became obvious that that wasn't how things were going to transpire, another student with considerably more experience in the game than many of the others began to hold an impromptu tutorial in rudimentary game skills, like building a crafting table and a basic set of wooden tools. It was so successful that I asked him to continue his workshop 2 days later, but without providing any explicit instruction about how to do so. I arrived at the start of class to discover that the student had transformed a nearby field into a procedural workspace with neatly divided plots for each student containing a water source, a bit of fertile farmland, and enough supplies in a chest to construct a tiny house, a bed, and plant a food supply. This emergent act of generosity and leadership set a tone for the rest of the term, which has been characterized by the same sort of reciprocity, with teams trading each other for necessary materials and frequently making gifts for each other. Under such conditions, the first step in our pedagogical process, in which the students developed a comprehension of the Minecraft algorithm through procedural elaboration, went very smoothly. As a result of regular discussions in various class Discord forums during the course of the week, I was soon getting the sense that the students were beginning to allegorize the readings. The hard evidence of successful allegorical builds began to arrive in the reflection papers accompanying the first group projects. I'll close by describing one of the more surprising and gratifying examples. One of the kinds of builds that appears on any Minecraft server is called a mob grinder. That's the big black thing in the back there. These are structures that players create in order to safely process monsters or mobs for the resources and experience points that they drop on their death. So it wouldn't surprise anyone familiar with the game that there is a project on the course called Meatpacking 1, for which the instructions are simply build some sort of mob grinder. What I paired this project with on the theoretical side was mechanization and death, from Siegfried Gideon's Mechanization Takes Command. Over the span of half a century, writers like Gideon, Willem Flusser, Bernard Schumi, and David Edgerton have looked at this topic from a variety of different fields, concluding that slaughterhouses exemplify both the triumphs of modernity and its worst failures, often simultaneously. Predictably, there are several such structures on our server. Most are constructed according to a deeply pragmatic, unadorned aesthetic out of whatever materials happen to be lying around, like this Enderman grinder. The one that I want to talk about today, though, the one that the students informally dubbed the murder hole, is different in several key respects. It is a traditional, fully functioning zombie grinder. So the way that it works is on the same principle as a slaughterhouse. It works by gravity. So there's a dark room down on the lower left of the image that makes the zombies. They climb up the water elevator on the left-hand side. You can see them going across the top, and then they fall to their imminent destruction on the right-hand side, where the players finish them off and get both the drops from the monsters and the experience for doing so. So this machine produces both the loot that the zombies drop and the experience that this generates, but it's constructed in a specific manner that not only makes its inner workings visible to the viewer, even its decorative elements have a pedagogical purpose, demonstrating the queasy relationship between kitsch and mechanized slaughter in the game. In sum, its design effectively turns the mob grinder into a teaching tool. All of the papers that concerned the mob grinder made reference to Gideon's work and were articulate about the similarities and differences between slaughterhouse architecture in-game and in historical circumstances. So far, so good. There was evidence of the success of the allegorical build in print. But where I sat up and took notice was when I realized that the best papers I received on this project were allegories not for Gideon's work, but for other readings on the syllabus. Heidegger's The Question Concerning Technology, and Sam Binkley's Kitsch as Repetitive System. The sophistication of the analysis is impressive. In the paper on Kitsch, the author sums up perfectly the complex nature of what they have produced. So this is one passage from it. Our capacity for emulation in Minecraft is limited by the blocks available to us. As a result, while we've conveyed a familiar message of slaughter, the subtextual layer of cultural significance is somewhat lacking. While our imitation evokes the sentimental value that Kitsch places on feeling, players are an extra layer removed from the reality we have tried to emulate. They bear witness to not just an imitation, but an abstraction of an imitation of reality. Thus, they must search deeper in the decorations we've used to discern the Kitsch aesthetic we aim to provide. Meanwhile, the Heidegger paper concludes, from Heidegger, we can see that the essence of technology predisposes players toward this revealing by mining their worlds into being. Though each played world is brought forth by its players, the sheer inexhaustibility of the game, by virtue of its near infinite capacity for generation, suggests that no framing could ever fully encapsulate it. Small comfort, I'm sure, for the zombies we already have at our standing reserve disposal. Earlier in this talk, when I suggested that the allegorical build was a third thing, this sort of thinking is what I had in mind. In these papers, which serve as an expression of these students' potential, certainly not the only one, but the one most visible to academics, the game isn't reduced to a prop to support the reading, and the readings don't become the justification for play. As the course comes to its end, I'm thinking a lot about the soft skills that this approach to teaching encourages. Over the last couple of days, as they completed their final papers, the students have been applying all of the interpersonal cooperative skills and all of the generosity they learned from working in game to the process of writing. The class Discord is full of instances of them coordinating their topics within groups, editing and proofreading each other's papers, sharing images, directing their peers to relevant secondary sources, asking questions about drafts, and testing out their analyses. As they shuttle back and forth between their projects in game and their readings with increasing confidence and sophistication, these students are deep in the allegorical process of becoming educated. So I'm going to turn off my screen share there, and Bart can pick up on the research part.
Yes, so I will follow up. I mean, in many ways, Darren and I working closely together on this project, in constant contact, he being the face of the class and me being in the back rooms, constantly navigating and negotiating the course as it develops, and then trying to make sense of it with this massive research team. So much of what I have to say elaborates on some of the points that Darren has already made, while trying to bring in some sense of the texture of the research data that we're trying to work with, and the larger research agenda, especially with respect to education and games, where we think we have a contribution to make. So Darren has already articulated the pedagogical goals of our course fairly well. And as he has explained, we set out to see if Minecraft could function as a platform for collaborative learning and critical thinking in an upper year undergraduate course on theories and ideologies of modernity. This is an importantly atypical deployment of a game in the context of even higher education. While video games have been a major focus of education research at the elementary and even secondary school levels, research on university level teaching with video games is rare. And where there is some deployment, it generally has to do with making the games themselves the object of the course, or else as a simulation tool in mostly STEM related courses. While our work on this is not unique, we wanted to push the idea of video games as environments for learning, especially during COVID, while also pushing our constructivist learning perspective by looking closely at how abstract ideas might be literally grappled with, given the particular material affordances of a game like Minecraft, a game about moving and building with blocks that make up a world. That is the idea of the allegorical build. To what extent is moving a block in Minecraft synonymous with moving an idea? Not in a literal sense where a block represents some real world corollary. It's not realism or simulation we are after, but where the blocks anchor or prompt an allegorical relationship to some specific topic or object of thought or action in the case of the class projects. To get at this, we knew right away that survey and evaluation-based methods would not be sufficient. What we needed was to get access to students' real-time thought processes and in-game activities. So we took advantage of the online teaching situation to log all student discussion in Minecraft and in Discord, as well as embedding two research assistants in class, anthropology research assistants in class as participant observers. We followed this with open-ended depth interviews with students at the end of the course, and this is the work that's still ongoing as the course comes to an end this term. Our methods were designed to help with the inference that playing the game and making sense of the course material mattered to one another. And a null result in this case would be that these things, the game and the readings, were experienced as unconnected bookends, despite all attempts by the professor and curriculum to make it otherwise. We were essentially pursuing a counterfactual value. What difference to students' thought and written work does playing Minecraft as the class experience make that couldn't be otherwise seen in the same class without Minecraft? In other words, does doing anything with Minecraft matter in terms of the core learning objectives of the course, or is it just engaging or possibly distracting window dressing on a course that could be taught conventionally with basically the same outcomes? For sure, our concerns about student engagement, especially during COVID, are non-trivial, as Darren has already discussed, and are almost certainly a necessary condition of the kind of learning we were hoping to capture. But engagement is ultimately secondary. One thing that educational research on games is clear on is that on the whole, games, video games, all games are good for student engagement, at least when compared to other conventional teaching modalities. We shouldn't expect engagement to be low when we're using video games in teaching. This finding is borne out in our case, where even the most cursory engagement data shows better results overall than most seminar courses of this kind, and especially during the pandemic when typical Zoom-driven seminars are reporting abysmal levels of engagement. On average, students spend more time not only with the game, but also in conversations on the Discord server and with the professor, reading the course material and listening to lectures. And all that's measured via Moodle and the Discord, and everything is logged. As well as more time completing the assignments and engaging with one another over their completion. It's an added bonus that we also see a significant amount of peer-to-peer engagement, as Darren has discussed, and group work in context that seems to excite students rather than depress them, as is usually the case. Engagement at this level, however, is not 100%, and some students do have difficulty accessing the game platform consistently for technical and or personal reasons. And the course design and learning curve of the game make it very difficult for students to catch up if they do not remain consistently involved. We've yet to see if the course makes unfair demands on students' time. As Darren showed, we're showing an average of 3 hours a day working with this course. That could be an unfair demand on students' time, but we'll be able to gauge this in part with the course evaluations, which are now coming in. But we can reasonably presume that the preconditions for students to engage in the way we hope have been met. Let me make a few further comments on the preconditions for the allegorical build as Darren has described it. Many folks will be familiar with Minecraft or the derivative Microsoft platform Minecraft Education. The basic idea of the game is fairly well known to almost all students under about age 30, probably a bit older than that now, worldwide, and this has much to do with the ubiquity of what has become the most popular video game of all time, with a cultural reach that I would say is equivalent to the Beatles or Star Wars in terms of basic familiarity. It is a game that is easy to play, but difficult to master, and those who play it invest great amounts of time, often returning to the game again and again over several years. It is a far more accessible mainstream commercial game for educational research than most other commercial video games on the one hand, but also more accessible than bespoke educational technology on the other. We believe this base cultural familiarity gives us an edge in terms of engagement that we might not have had otherwise, and students less familiar with the game could more easily be helped by peers or family members, especially their kids. It's important to note also that we do not use the base game, but instead use something called modded Minecraft, which relies on the Java edition of the game plus any number of additional free and open source mods or add-ons that are created by players or modders from all over the world. The mods add both a degree of complexity to both managing and playing the game, as well as give us more freedom to adapt the game to our pedagogical goals. It also enables us to develop new mods of our own, which, unlike most instructional technology, stands to have a potential user base in the millions. The current top mod has over 100 million downloads. The mods also add a level of challenge for students who have already played the base game, so we have more dynamic engagement for both experienced and inexperienced players. The other important reason to use modded Minecraft is to help break the stigma associated with Minecraft as a mere children's game. We gave our students literally permission to play in this sense because the mods allow for a degree of sophistication that the game's publisher, Microsoft Moijang, would not develop for its core market of youth and children. Now, most critically for our pedagogical argument, we play the game in survival mode rather than creative mode, which is how Minecraft is most commonly used in educational contexts. In creative mode, there is no fighting and you cannot die. You have access to all the possible blocks in the game to build with as you like. It is this mode that is referred to when most commentators talk about the creative and sandbox elements of play in Minecraft, and all of those epic creations that sometimes make it into the mainstream news are all done in creative mode. Survival mode is the normal mode of the game, and crucially is what creates the conditions of possibility for the allegorical play we are concerned with. Students are forced to confront the affordances of the game and develop strategies for overcoming challenges, whether navigating through the world, defeating monsters, or building a house without falling to the ground. And the question becomes one of how any particular line of thought in terms of the course content might relate to those strategies, as Darren has already discussed. Without the need to deal with the challenge endemic to the modded survival game, the experience would be entirely one-sided, as players impose their visions of the world without constraint from either the game or the course material. We need a simple example. It's easy enough to show students some images or give them readings about modernist architecture, for instance. Perhaps Moshe Safdie's Habitat 67 is apropos. The iconic brutalist housing development in Montreal is often referred to in courses on modernism and architecture, so you could find references to it everywhere. In creative mode, the students could attempt to recreate the sprawling and complex concrete structure, getting a three-dimensional sense of the use of materials and the arrangement of space and light, similar perhaps to an architectural maquette or a digital model, which are often used in architecture courses. It would already be a different experience from simply reading about habitat, but in survival mode, the blocks that are used to create Habitat 67 must come from the landscape and will require various sorts of processing that turn sand and gravel into concrete. The structure must also be protected from wandering monsters. Some are able to actually blow the house up and so on. The practicalities of the game force the students working in groups and discussing their strategies to adapt their understanding of Safdie's architectural experiment to a fictional world where the consequences are allegorically related to the actual material and cultural context that Safdie was working in. The idea is not to literally represent this context, but to create the cognitive and imaginary space for the student to consider it, to research it on their own and formulate interpretations tied to both the course material, which serves as a starting place for thought, and practical experience of trying to accomplish something in the game despite the challenges. As one student writes reflexively in a paper on the project, quote, translating Habitat 67 into our Minecraft world ironically undermines almost every notable element of the real life building beyond its iconic appearance. At the core of Habitat's modern allure is the way in which it was constructed, with modular elements assembled in a factory, then stacked one on top of the other with the help of a crane. The standardization and quick assembly were cornerstones of the building's modernism, which is completely undermined by our Minecraft homage. 40 blocks in the air, teetering on the edge of some hastily erected scaffolding, counting each L-shape outline out block by block. I wish that I had the ability to pre-assemble our units on the ground and pop them into place. My teammates, blocks in hand, filled in the units again, block by block, and then it was once again time for me to count out the outline for the next floor. This act of placing each block by hand felt like traditional craftsmanship, and hardly the modernist exercise this building is meant to embody. In this way, our Minecraft build is a tribute to a modern approach to home construction that it can, in many ways, never be. Beautiful writing. This is the kind of thing we're looking for. The student here uses the feeling of building Habitat by hand in the game as a way of highlighting one of the core modernist elements of Habitat, that of industrial prefabrication. prefabricating the modular housing of habitat is not a literal possibility in the game, but through their reading and practical game activities, the student is able to interpret and imagine the difference that prefabrication as a facet of the modernist agenda was meant to be about. Such an interpretation would not be as forthcoming in creative mode, where the feeling of traditional craftsmanship would be obviated by the pull-down menus of blocks one can place with impunity. Still, other events related to the construction of habitat, fighting off a monster invasion, or traveling to a dangerous area in search of rare materials to create a modern lighting aesthetic, these all become occasions for thinking through acting in the game, always split between the concerns that playing the game as a game requires and the course framing in which those concerns are meant to be situated. In another class project, students take on the task of modernizing a Minecraft village. One student had this reflection on her thought in an interview that we did. The Slack and Wise piece was about colonialism and stuff like that. It got a lot of wheels turning because of like our proximity to the village and how I had already started going over to that village and taking their stuff. And I feel like there had already been discussions in class and in lectures about entitlement to resources. And I leaned into that, you know. I was like, I'm just gonna like go over to the village. I'm gonna steal all their terracotta. They're not using it. They don't care. And then, so yeah, we had these wheels started turning about having a project that involves a village and our entitlement to the village. But like, you know, we were talking about our plans for the village, and then the prof was like, oh, like make sure you do all this research about like raids and about zombies, and like you're talking about, this is Darren, they're telling them this, talking about rail lines, but like villagers don't use rails. They'll get stuck in them, but it's not useful for them. And I was like, yeah, no, that's the point. And I wrote this paragraph about like why the fact that our improvements are useless to the people, or people, you know, to the moms that live in the village, is like kind of the point of the project. Here, the student moves fluidly between the course readings, Lack and Wise, the comments of the professor to consider monster invasions and the need for walls, and rail transport in the context of a lecture on modernity and logistics, and the student's experience of playing with the Minecraft village, playing as if they were a colonizer as they understand it, and thinking imaginatively about the lives that these simple NPC villagers might represent, including the last bit about the moms that live in the village, a direct reference to the writing of Carolyn Marvin on technology and domesticity. What is also important in this case is that the village project develops almost over half the duration of the course, so the students can iterate on their intervention with the village in response to developing conversations and understandings of the course material. It is early days still, and field data from the course is now rolling in, but our notes are full of stories like these, so we think there is promise in both our course design and the methods of evaluation in this case. The point to end with here for this audience is perhaps to underscore an argument that games as instructional technologies are able to do much more than engagingly deliver didactic course content. If we leverage the allegorical play element that exists in all games, because the worlds depicted in games are not real, we may open up space for collaborative critical thought and reflection on difficult and abstract course material. The idea of the allegorical build as pedagogy is to open spaces of interpretation within the game that both enrich play and are inflected by the course material. The student player remains the key agent in this story, bringing these elements together, or not, and all that we can do as instructional designers is set the conditions of possibility for the student's engagement in allegorical terms. Thank you.
Okay. So when I was last speaking before I turned it over to Darren and Bart to tell you about the actual project that was launched within the lab, we were talking about the values that were at the core of the work that we're doing in the Lab for Innovation in Teaching and Learning. And I think these values are pretty evident in the ways that Bart and Darren were able to describe the successes of the project. Okay, so I'm going to come back to this new version of the innovation cycle that we're now working with. And my remarks are very short, so I promise we'll have time for some questions. So as we're about to enter into year 2 of the institutional sponsor of this Minecraft project, the Lab for Innovation in Teaching and Learning, it's been important for us as the administrative leaders of the lab to think about how our earliest innovation cycle failed to allow us to capitalize on that network mindset as a value that I referenced earlier, to let iteration really sit at the heart of our work with multiple points of entry. And this diagram itself, I think, needs to be revised as I was reflecting and writing this paper, because we don't have multiple points of entry. It has a very clear beginning point. So now that the Minecraft project, or this class anyway, is wrapping up, we're eager to think forward to how to validate these initial findings and iterate to new developments. Though this has obvious implications for the lab and its work in supporting the research and pedagogical team to provide the infrastructure, funding, and institutional space to continue, we also come to the last two challenges that I highlighted earlier. What is the role of the university administration in supporting this work? Why would we care, with all respect, Darren, about this one class, for instance, as I sit in the provost's office? And in posing this question, then, I necessarily confront the conceptual edges of the lab. That is, at what point does the project as a class offered within an academic department no longer live within the lab? At what point do we have a post-lab infrastructure fund, for instance, and attention to administrative processes that would truly make this lab project a success? And so let me just advance this. And so in posing this question, then I have just some kind of like closing questions to think about as we think about this project in particular. So in supporting this class, how do we support its continued offering? So how do we make sure that this isn't just a one-off, as I was saying before about some of our other investments in pedagogical innovation? How do we ensure this isn't a one-off, that these processes and the way to support it not being a one-off are specifically connect to processes that are well outside the domain of a lab for innovation in teaching and learning, and even outside the provost's office where I sit. They live, in fact, in a specific department, in a specific faculty, and are well beyond the control of us. If we think about the innovation cycle for a moment, at what point have we, quote unquote, launched our product? And is this even the right language to use? Or does the conceptual design of a lab as something connected to a world of innovation fail at precisely this moment when we're talking about a concrete class? If we've launched the product, how do we, and here I'm meaning little, I'm meaning the university administration, intervene to ensure its viability by having server support, TA support, modding support? These are all costs that are never part of a funding formula for any average class, academic class that's being given. It's well beyond the means for this individual academic department to support, and well beyond, I'd say, the thinking of the faculty in thinking about its average typical costs of running classes, particularly in the humanities, I'll say. Maybe not so much so in the sciences. In assessing student learning, how do we evaluate success, and by whose standards and for what end? That is, student learning as measured by individual faculty members teaching, a department, a faculty, a provost's office. They all have slightly different takes on how to evaluate student learning, and how will we keep all of those actually in tandem, not in competition, not with one more important than the other, but in tandem. In posing then the question of where the conceptual edges of a lab lie, I'm intentionally thinking about how the conditions of success importantly lie outside the lab itself, once a project has proven to have some legs, if you will, and rest within the control of a host of actors outside the lab itself. And this critically then, I'll say, becomes the additional work that we now take on in year 2. And so with that, we have 4 minutes left for questions. And so I'll open the floor to any particular questions you might have.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Darren, Sandra, and Bart. There is the chat function. So if anybody has any questions, I know I do. If we don't, feel free to chat your questions, and we will be able to get to them. In the meantime, while we wait, I'm gonna ask a question that I often like to hear about, right? It's the sort of, we know the successes, we know what works. I'm just curious, because my work blurs that line of communication studies, education, educational technology. So it's for me, I find it fascinating to hear what hasn't worked, or what have been some of the limitations and the pitfalls. I know you sort of mentioned a few, Bart mentioned a few from when you were reading the story from the participant, but What have you come across so far that hasn't worked and lessons learned from it?
A couple of things. The students down at the low end, who played, 10 hours, 12 hours, 1 hour, there were about 5 of them. And for the most part, they kind of opted out of the course about halfway through. I had one student, amazingly, who actually contracted COVID, convalesced, came back and rejoined the class and rejoined his project. So there is actually an opportunity to bounce back with this stuff, which is really kind of interesting. But I mean, one of the things that Bart and I talk about is like, who are we capturing with this that we wouldn't otherwise? There's a kind of interesting middle. There are students who are really interested in games who end up producing exceptional work academically because they're really interested in the project. And then there are really eloquent writers and thinkers who learn something about the game, and they also do interesting things. But that low end, in terms of participation, is part of the problem. Why does that happen? How can we do something to help those students? So that's one thing. And then like the other question is just like, oh Lord, are we doing too much? Like when you have a student who's spending 365 hours on your server over the course of the term, maybe they're a little too enthused about it. I mean, mind you, in Minecraft, there's a thing that you do called away from keyboard, where if you're running a process in the background, you need your avatar to be present. So there are students who will like log on and not do stuff for 8 hours while their machines are grinding away in the background. So some of those like upper level people for sure are doing stuff like that. But those are some of the things that worry me about all of this.
Yeah, I should weigh in a little bit on that hours played stuff. So one of the things we're getting from the field data now is something that you might call like community collateral or something like that. So part of all that invested time is playing with classmates, is building the capacity for this peer-to-peer relationship, especially during COVID when everybody's reporting they feel disconnected and stuff like that. So I mean, it's a bit of a strange moment to worry about the time played, and in this case probably time that the excessive time played students are reporting they're very grateful for. That may not be the case in a non-pandemic situation, I don't know, but it's also something worth investigating in terms of creating that sort of bedrock of community amongst students that then later can be mobilized, not just for our class but other classes where those students encounter each other that they played with intimately for hours on end.
Cool, thank you. So there is one question. So Samir wrote, what subjects do you think Minecraft can be applied across and what different contexts?
Yeah, we've started talking about this because, I mean, the easy one, the low-hanging fruit is modernity, because Minecraft's sort of thematic universe roughly spans early modernity to early industrialization. But we were in the middle of this and suddenly we were thinking, oh, we could do medievalism, we could do philosophy, we could do cultural studies, we could do anthropology, we could do sociology, depending on the time that you have to shape the game environment. And that's the affordance that modding gives you, but you actually have to have people who know how to do that. Like we had a designer with many years experience. We have a postdoc who knows the game better than any single human ever should. We have engineers who can build stuff for us. So we had a lot of help with this. But early in the term, we noticed that there's a group on the prairies that's using Minecraft for Indigenous studies, and they have like a whole series of mods for an indigenized version of the game. So there are lots of things that you can do with it. There are rails, like there are some things that it won't work for, but it would work for a surprisingly large number of topics, I think.
It also opens up the bigger question of what other game platforms besides Minecraft that we can begin using if we're exploring allegory as our pedagogical sort of focus. And so that's something we want to start to get into. Minecraft is a great starting point because of its ubiquity, but of course from there the sky's the limit in terms of possible game platforms where we can explore different kinds of topics, and the affordances of those platforms can lend themselves to those topics. But the key takeaway is to move away from simulation as the modality by which games become useful, and inhabit the allegorical moment more robustly. And I think that's our main contribution. We think going forward, pushing on that is where we can really see a lot of productive work.
Cool, thank you. Yeah, I was going to mention earlier, the fact that it's done at a university level is unique, because it has been done, it's not new, but most of the research and most of the studies tend to really focus and narrow in on K-12 and CEGEPs as well, but in university it's rare. And I think, Darren, you explained it well, where you there's the support of the lab, but you also have a team that's helping out with expertise, right? Subject matter experts in different areas. So I think that's fascinating. There's no other questions, but I do have one question. This is often a hot topic with instructional designers. What are your thoughts when people ask you, are you gamifying the course?
No.
What is your reaction to that?
No, because I'm not giving them badges. I'm not rewarding them with something that only means something in a digital context. This is very definitely a class about modernity, and it's structured nominally around group work, but the real work that they do is individual paper writing. Like overwhelmingly, that's the bulk of their grade. So gamification is that's a bad word.
So the way I
Clark
always
can
talk about it,
probably say
don't even get me started. So the key to gamification for me is that there's no play in gamification, it's work. And if it's the play element that you're leveraging for teaching, gamification strategies are exactly the wrong approach to take, because then you're working for a badge or whatever, and you're not actually playing at all. Anyway, big discussion there.
Yeah, no, that's why I wanted to ask that, because sorry, my phone just started ringing. Because of that, because the initial reaction in a lot of the earlier work and a lot of the work that's done in K-12 is they add that patch and that layer of it's gamified, and I think it's used to sort of sell it and get the engagement. But no, your answer was the right answer. So I will take this opportunity to thank each of you for your time, for submitting, for attending, and more importantly for, I think the research that you're doing is really pushing things through, and it is innovative, and it's risking. It's definitely, there's a risk involved, as you know. I've been there, I've tried certain things, and you fail, but you get back up and you keep building. And I think it is changing the landscape of pedagogy, education, and I think it's because it's being done in such an interdisciplinary lens that it just brings in things that you're not maybe used to seeing communicate and work together, and I think that in itself is innovative. So first of all, thank you for the work and the research you're doing, and thank you for being here and contributing that research to the CNIE community.
Yep, thanks for the opportunity. It's fun.
Thank you. Thank you everybody for joining us today.